Welcome everybody to the second Stories from the Matrix webinar. So thanks for attending and joining me this evening. I have a lot of stuff, interesting stuff, I hope, to talk about this evening. The main topic being Project Red Dog, which is associated with the most significant presently undiscovered artifact. And so I have a kind of a layout of how I want to go over this information tonight with you. The last one of these that I did went on for pretty long, almost 3 hours. I had a lot of work to cover. This one I attempted to make it a little bit shorter, but as I was kind of going through my notes and going through the reviewing work, there's still quite a bit of work, quite a bit of stuff to go through. So if you can't stay for the whole thing, don't worry. It is being recorded. It will be up on YouTube. But the first part of this, I'm going to go over pretty basic about what remote viewing is, because there may be some people who watch this or even here that are in the webinar that aren't completely familiar with what remote viewing is. So I'm going to briefly touch that. After that, I'm going to go into the remote viewing project, which is Project Red Dog. And then I actually have a second project that I'm going to discuss after Red Dog that I believe is rather pertinent to that project. It's directly connected, I believe, to Red Dog, and it's something that is going to kind of pave the way for the next couple presentations I'm going to put together that are associated with Red Dog. So I don't want to kind of give that away yet. I'll kind of let it unfold, and you guys will see what I'm talking about once I get there, on why I think it's important. But so anyway, thanks for joining me. I guess I'll talk just real briefly about who I am if it's the first time this is only the second webinar I've hosted. So if you're new to the Technical Intuition or Stories from the Matrix, I'm Brett Stuart. I have a background in political science and parliamentary speech and debate at the university level. But instead of going into law, I went into art and character animation. So that was until I got into remote viewing, and for about almost past 10 years now, I've been focusing primarily on that as a focus. As far as my interests, personal interests, I run a consulting business on the side. I do some other stuff. I work for a couple businesses as well for client work that's remote viewing related. But just kind of this really short synopsis of how I got into this, because there's no school necessarily right now, at least, to get into remote viewing, as far as I know. I mean, there's definitely some, I suppose, psychic kind of schools you can go to that are classes. But for me, it really began when, in 2010, I had an experience that completely changed the way that I view reality. And it's funny because I think it's next week here in Phoenix, there is the International UFO Conference. And it's kind of funny. I wish I had known it was here earlier. I probably would have attended. But in 2010, I ended up seeing an incredibly massive triangle fly over my head in the San Francisco Bay Area. It was around 1 a.m. in the morning. I was out back. I was still working as an animator at the time. I hadn't really shifted. I was doing that professionally still. And for about, time basically stood still, but for about 7 to 10 seconds, first I saw it out of the corner of my eye. It was an absolutely massive triangle slowly started going over my head. And then after that, right after it went over the roof of the house, it took off in an instant, in a flash. And, I was standing there. I had no context for what I just witnessed. If I'd just seen a triangle, I probably would have left it at, okay, this is probably some military thing, or, it's just it's a strange airplane. But it's when it went from just past overhead to beyond the horizon in as fast as you could snap your fingers, that's when my whole frame on reality was shattered. And from there, that led me to remote viewing, because I had a lot of questions and I didn't have a lot of answers. And so a consciousness skill, and I did a whole bunch of stuff before remote viewing, like lucid dreaming, out-of-body projection, a number of other things that I tested and tried to see if they were real. But ultimately, once I got into remote viewing, I started seeing the feedback process of doing the work, and it was showing me time and time again that this was a real skill that could be taught. And ever since then, I was hooked, and I've been doing it ever since. So I ended up working with a number of the individuals. If anyone here is familiar with the Stargate program. I'm not really going to go into the history of the remote viewing program, just a real basic synopsis, brief synopsis on how it works. There's a lot of other YouTube videos and documentaries, a bunch of stuff on the Stargate program, which was when U.S. intelligence agencies funded the research for basically developing remote viewing. And I ended up, after doing it kind of on the side, I ended up working with a couple of those individuals that came out of that program. And so I learned from them. And then from there, I ended up writing a book about it. And also a couple people here, I'm sure, know me through the State of Reality website, which was where I collected a couple of remote viewing professionals, and we wrote articles about different projects, from the lunar wave to the next president to what else did we do? We did a lot of projects there. And so that was kind of the next, writing articles about remote viewing was kind of the next step. And then eventually the most recent thing, which I've been doing, is it started with Troika Group and then it's kind of evolved into Technical Intuition because Khan has moved on to other things. We're still great friends. He had other opportunities, and some other things came up for him that he had to step away from remote viewing for a while. But it's evolved, and we kind of put this on the radar as we started looking into, or a lot of people that know my work from, is the work I did on Maria the Nazca Mummy. And I did 2 radio shows on that, and how it was pretty interesting. I talked about it in the previous webinar. If you saw it, you haven't seen that one, you can see it watched on YouTube. I went really in depth on that project and the remote viewing data that came out of it. So if that interests you, check that out on YouTube. But it's kind of moving forward of where I'm at now with Stories from the Matrix is I view this as it's going to be turning into more videos, live presentations like this. There's going to be shorter videos on projects on YouTube, which I'll be talking about different remote viewing stuff. And then it's also going to evolve, something I'll talk about at the very end of this webinar and then be releasing later this month. It's going to evolve into community-based people who are interested in practicing and learning remote viewing. It's also going to kind of go in tandem with that as well. So it's kind of the projects as well as the actual learning it for people that find that interesting. Obviously not everyone's interested in spending time to learn it, so it's which is fine. But it's kind of attempt to do both here. Talk about the projects that are interesting, and then also those are interested do teaching as well. So anyway, what is Stories from the Matrix here? This is something, like I said, it's constantly evolving, but there's something that I feel is kind of important to talk about that has come up with a number of discussions I had with people over the past month. And this has to do with, why am I doing these webinars and why do I personally believe this is important right now? And I think that the topics involved, as far as the most significant presently undiscovered artifact, which is Red Dog, as well as the one I'm going to talk about afterwards. And I have about 5 lined up. I won't tell you about the one at the end of tonight, but the other ones lined up right now are what's going on in Antarctica. There's another one. I've talked already in the past a little bit about the work that I've done on reality, but a big kind of like a vision that I see of where Stories from the Matrix is going to go is it's going to become essentially, my goal is to provide an outline for what's going on kind of both above and below here on Earth, and things that remote viewing has a unique and kind of uncanny way of kind of pulling back the curtain and describing. And so who players are, what different agencies are involved, what's going on in different places that we only hear about through an occasional whistleblower. And even then, are those whistleblowers, creating a fantastical tale, or are they actually real? And so I'll have more to talk about that later, but kind of this is where I see this going. And I think it's, when I learned remote viewing in the first place, and when I began teaching it, it was about in 2013. And my mentor at the time, who worked for the Stargate program, he encouraged me to not ever touch any of this type of stuff. He's like, don't talk about aliens, don't talk about anything that has to do with reality or that's outside of the mainstream, because the moment you do that, you're not going to be able to do contract work for large businesses anymore. And the thing is kind of as time has evolved, time has gone on, not necessarily evolved, but I decided that really didn't resonate with me. because it was the whole reason why I got into RV in the first place, was to look at different mysteries, see what's there. Because once you kind of understand how remote viewing works, you're kind of put into a big library, like an all-access pass to what's going on here and in the universe. And so to not talk about that when I'm really passionate about it, when it excites me, it's what keeps me continually running projects in remote viewing, just didn't make sense. And maybe if it's is it continuing to work in Silicon Valley or something like that, that would make sense. But instead I decided to kind of pursue this particular passion of sharing stories about the remote viewing stuff that I find interesting about what's going on here. And then ultimately I think it's also, there's a lot of, not all, but I think that there's a lot of material that's come out about what's going on right now from remote viewers and others. And essentially there's, I'm sorry if there's a little distortion in audio. Sometimes Zoom kind of messes up a little bit like that. But there's something that goes on with releasing this kind of information as far as from remote viewing to whistleblowers. And that's that it kind of leaves people, it's a sense of fear-mongering in a sense. And there's been a lot of that for remote viewing. So my goal with this project, for Project Red Dog and a lot of the other ones, is that it doesn't kind of leave it in that state, okay, here's something that's really kind of spooky or something that's, to worry about. It's like, well, what can we do about it? And that's kind of the way that I approach this type of stuff. So when I get to the Project Red Dog, that's where I'll kind of share a couple of my thoughts on that. So from there, moving forward, I've already gone over the map, a little bit about myself, and then where I see stories from the Matrix going. I'm just going to briefly go over what remote viewing is for anyone who is not familiar with it, and then jump into the project of Project Red Dog. So let me swap my screen over here. Okay. So beginning with Project Red Dog, with remote viewing. If you haven't heard about it before, remote viewing is a trained ability. It's not something that you naturally can do. Now, there are those who are like natural psychics who can use their intuition to get idea of what's happened in a place, what's happening non-locally. But the actual act of remote viewing is a skill. It's something that was developed and is trained. And what the skill is it's using your unconscious mind to communicate accurate information to your conscious awareness about an unseen or hidden, usually at a distance, person, place, thing, or event. And this is accomplished by employing one of the many methodologies, one of which was developed by the military, which is referred to as controlled remote viewing. And then there's others. Extended remote viewing is another methodology. There's a couple other ones out there, scientific remote viewing. And using these various techniques, these are structured techniques that allow you to access information about something at a distance. And it's quite a feat, but essentially what you can do, and I'll show an example of this in just a second, is that you begin with simple practice targets, where someone may take a picture of something from like National Geographic, put it in an envelope, and then when you practice, you describe what's in that envelope without knowing what's on the internal contents. And then you're able to match up side by side. Okay, what's my level of accuracy? Is it 60%, 70%? And so when you practice and you slowly increase that over time. But where the name Stories from the Matrix comes from, and what kind of allows this to work, the theory behind it at least, is this concept of what is the Matrix. And while it's a movie, the movie actually borrowed that name from the declassified internal remote viewing documents. And the definition, what the physicist who developed remote viewing defined it as, was a non-material, highly structured, and mentally accessible framework of information about all data pertaining to everything in the universe, both physical and non-physical. And it seems to be located in a place that is outside of time. And the reason that we believe this is because you can access information about events that haven't happened yet. You can also access information through these structured processes about the past as well. So event recreation at the same time. And so you essentially have a library about everything that has happened, is happening in present time, and then could potentially happen in the future. The future is a little bit more complicated than that, but essentially it has to do, what we think is that it has to do with probabilities is that you remote view. Like, for example, when we remote viewed the next president of the United States, this was in March of 2016, and the data that came back from that was essentially one of the viewers in that project actually got the name Trump, and we published that work in March of 16. But that was, whether or not it was set in stone or whether or not it was simply the highest probability, and that was what came through the remote viewing work, ultimately did turn out being correct. But whether or not kind of distant events are 100% kind of in stone, no one really has an answer to that at this point. But you can see in the future, you can do predictive work. A lot of the work, there's a lot of remote viewers that use this for market predictions. They use it for stock market up and down, sports betting, things and the like. And so you can get a pretty high track record as far as upwards of 80% accuracy rate of predicting future events in that kind of capacity. And that's using something that's referred to as associative remote viewing. But essentially what we're working with, though, is a library of information. And then it's essentially that describes everything. Finally, the way that the protocol works, the way that we run this, and so every remote viewer is going to do this. The way this project works for Project Red Dog, the artifact, and even all other ones when you ever hear of a remote viewer talking about something, is that it's a three-part protocol, a three-part process. First, it's not, remote viewers aren't just sitting here and letting stream of consciousness come in. Essentially what is set up is it's a formulated target first. So typically there's a project manager or a second party that sets something up. That is then given to, which is part 2, the RV skill, it's given to a remote viewer, and then they run it, but they run it in what's called blind. So they don't know what the target ever is. So all the remote viewing session work that I'm going to talk about tonight, and I'll show some scans of some of the work, all of this work was done blind. That means that as a viewer, didn't know what they were viewing. So it was just essentially a set of numbers that was used as a reference. And so then the skill is employed, you end up doing analysis after the fact, and then you get feedback. So it's these three parts that actually make up what remote viewing is, as opposed to, say, a natural psychic, for example, would be someone who may spontaneously get an impression, or might go to a place and they sense what they sense, but they don't necessarily know what it is they're after. But it's a very structured methodology as far as what remote viewing is. And so you can set up different pools of targets that you can keep yourself blind as a viewer. So you can set up, say, 200 targets that you're interested in looking at, and then you can generate those. And that's one way for remote viewers to do it. You can also have project managers send you stuff as well as a viewer. So that's basically how it works. One quick example here, and this is from the book I released in 2016. It's not available right now, but I'll talk more about that, some events that are coming up at the end of this month about this book and some other stuff that I'm doing. But at the bottom here, this is the feedback photo. So this is how remote viewers practice, is you'll take a photo of, like this, for example, this dragonfly, put it in an envelope, and then that'll be given to them, or you give it to somebody else. And so you may, obviously, if you know what the photo was and you put it into the envelope, it wouldn't make sense. And what a session looks like, it's very diagrammatic. And so it's a very simple sketch with descriptors on the page that they're writing down in the structured manner that results in a couple different pages or a site template. But it would look like something like this. So for example, here is a site template of this particular photo. So it's very diagrammatic. We have a vertical stem. We have this transparent membrane on the side here. It's ornamental. There's this stem below it, and this thing is resting. So in a way, remote viewing oftentimes, especially when you're practicing photographs, it's describing something without naming it. In this work, it wasn't ever a dragonfly that was named. It was the description of the dragonfly that was named. So the membrane, the beauty of it, the fact that it's placed on a stem. This is how the process works. Another example, and this is one actually from the original military program, this is a sketch that was rendered from satellite photo during the Cold War of a USSR research facility. And on the next page, this was given to remote viewers. Over here on the right-hand side, this was one of the sketches that the remote viewers produced. About several hours of transcripts also came along with this, and a whole bunch of other sketches. But this just shows the type of accuracy, the side-by-side comparison that you can achieve by practicing this specific methodology. So it can get very specific, but oftentimes it's very simple, basic drawings, diagrammatic representations with high-level concepts and descriptors associated with them. So from there, that should give you kind of an overall understanding of what remote viewing is and how it works. After that, really there's a lot of different ways you can use the skill. You can use it in a way that looks at different things like unknowns, but you can also use it in your life, from in your business to optimum trajectories, a whole bunch of other stuff. So there's a lot of different ways you can use the tool. But for tonight's topic, for Stories from the Matrix, what I'll be discussing is Red Dog, which is the most significant presently undiscovered artifact. And this was a project that I began in 2013. And this was right after I learned the advanced remote viewing techniques. And I was really interested in running a large group project between a number of intermediate and advanced viewers to see how far you take the skill, to see what we could do with it. Because there's a couple of methods to where you can really get very detailed sketches about sites and different targets. So in this case, the artifact. But there's also some more experimental ones where you can locate objects on a map by using geographical coordinates. So my idea behind this project was, well, let's see if we can get really, really detailed information about some object, an artifact, and then secondarily use the skill and see if we can actually find it and go put feet on the ground, get it, and bring it back. Maybe it's something that belongs in the Smithsonian. And I was a little naive, I suppose, I was expecting something, I wanted something that was newsworthy to bring attention to remote viewing, to bring more people, say, hey, this is a real phenomenon. But, what I was envisioning going into the project was that it might be something that you could bring back, it was like a vase or something. I don't know. It's something that was maybe not too large. I suppose the be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it, applies here. Because what came back out of this project was not something that would readily be relocated to somewhere else. Where it pointed to was a location, and then the artifact was kind of affixed in that location. So from this started in 2013. The original team size was about 7 viewers. All the viewers were obviously blind, and all of the work that's going to be shown tonight was executed by blind tasking protocols. So, but the original work, this work spans over 2 years of off and on. It's not straight because you have to take breaks in between these projects. But over the course of about 2 years, 2 years was about when the last project, the last queue was run to look at this from a specific angle. And so from here, though, before I get into some of the data, something popped up. I mentioned this on Facebook. Something popped up on the 1st relating to Project Red Dog. And this is one of the viewers who was responsible for some of the work on Red Dog sent a cease and desist letter after I posted this webinar to talk about these project findings, and which really caught me by surprise because I'd worked for a while with this individual a number of years ago. We kind of ended things on good terms. He went his way, I went my own way, working on other projects. And then out of the blue on the 1st, he said he believes that he owns the intellectual property of this specific topic. And that any kind of disclosure or release of this information that was essentially run through this project, he threatened legal action from this. And, I'm not going to really go into names about who sent this, but I received a very official email, which I had to essentially bring to my attorney and say, okay, is there merit to this or is there not merit to this? And essentially he's like, you've really nothing to worry about, because essentially what we presented here was actually the last time we spoke about this particular topic, everyone associated with the project, this was in 2016, was when we spoke last, everyone that was part of this project. I was about to do a number of radio interviews on Project Red Dog, and everyone was in agreement that this was perfectly fine. And so, not to mention that what I'm going to be showing tonight is my remote viewing work. I'm not showing anyone else's specific remote viewing work, even though a lot of the way the remote viewing works in general is that you have multiple viewers and all the viewers are coming back with the same data, the same concepts. And so this is what we refer to as corroborating information. So, for example, in that dragonfly photograph, if I were to run it and then somewhere else were to run it, we should both come back with dragonfly drawings, because if not, they don't corroborate. Now, that's a little more simple because you actually have a photo feedback. But when you don't have a photographic feedback, you simply have a cue that you're being told, okay, this is what the target is that you looked at. You need corroboration between viewers to know whether or not, okay, am I off in La La Land, or do we have something tangible, something solid here? And so he believed that this project was his because he ran work on some of this project. And which I completely disagree. And I believe that, with stories from the Matrix, with kind of the content I'm producing, that this is probably the project I spent the most personal remote viewing time invested on. And it's really been a crux of a lot of the different, it's kind of a foundation point to jump off into a lot of the other projects that I've worked on since then. And so I believe that there's a lot of people who may find this interesting. And, I'm not going to let legal threats kind of prevent me from moving forward and sharing this information. So I do have, though, two kind of hypotheses on why I think this is happening now, though. Because, and I'll talk just real briefly about this before I go into the work, but I think it's important. I have an anecdote that you might find interesting. But the first is that I think that what's associated with Red Dog, it is going to be coming along. It does tie into a lot of stuff that's going on in Antarctica. It has a lot of stuff that is being talked about in various disclosure groups. And I'm not surprised, I suppose, that I would get some type of pushback to even just talk about this project publicly. Where it came from, that pushback surprised me. And even some of the others I reached out to a number of the other viewers, and some of the emails I responded, it took them by surprise as well. So it's just one individual seems to feel this way. But the second is that there's a concept in psychology, it's called emotional hijack. And I've talked about a number of people about this over the past couple of weeks. And I've talked about this even on the radio show, when I did the Jimmy Church radio show, talking about the Nazca mummy, that remote viewing responsibly is not something that's out there right now as far as in different teaching methods, at least that I'm aware of. It's very rare, at least if it's maybe, I know one person who's doing it, one professional that kind of mentions it, but ethics and remote viewing responsibly and really using discernment on what you look at based upon kind of where you're at personally is not really exerted by a lot of viewers that I'm aware of. That's not really a topic of discussion. And it's my belief that from my own experiences and speaking with a number of other professional remote viewers who have direct experience with this, that when you jump into, let's say, the void or the matrix, and you put your nose in places that are not simple, you're not looking at yesterday's lunch, or you're not looking at even just like a presidential election, let's say ancient artifacts, things that are non-terrestrial, things that are very unique, let's say, types of life forms. There's something that occurs in remote viewing where what you're looking at has an ability to look back. And it's happened a couple times to me. And I personally believe that if you engage in this type of activity repeatedly, and you have kind of this belief that you're invulnerable to being affected by it, that there's a potential for hijack to occur. And I'm going to give you just one brief example. This is a story that, well, I've only shared with a couple people, but it's something that I kind of want to bring a little bit more light on because it's a project which I'll be talking about in the future. I won't go into the details of the project. Suffice it to say that I ended up 2 years ago looking at something that was referred to as a higher dimensional being that's being widely talked about in various whistleblower communities on the secret space program. And after running a project of looking at this thing, it turned out it was a real life form. For 2 weeks after that, there were a number of instances and occurrences that were happening in my life directly from white orbs flashing through my room, where I was physically seeing things fly through my room, to what I refer to as just out of sight dark spheres, where you can see them move and they move just outside your peripheral vision, to when I was going to sleep, as I would wake up on my side and there'd be like a really heavy feeling attached to my back where I couldn't move, to the final thing. This was kind of like where I ended up stopped remote viewing for a period of time after this. But there was an individual that at the time I used to take a number of walks back and forth to the beach before I'd sit down to do a remote viewing session. And on one of these, an individual was standing right there on the path. And as soon as I saw him, I had massive goosebumps go right up the back of my spine. And part of me told me that, okay, I should turn around, but don't do it because you don't want to let this individual know that you do know something's amiss with this. So I kept walking, and kind of long story short, I was able to, he tried to interact with me. I didn't really engage him. I kept down the path, and when I turned around, he was standing there with both of his arms to his side, looking at me kind of with like this dead face, like looking straight at me. And after that, over the course of 2 weeks, I had premonition of about 30 seconds on 2 other occasions where I felt this guy is near. He's walking really quick down the road. I need to hurry up so that I don't kind of intersect with this individual when I'm walking back to my house. And sure enough, I pick up the pace. I look to my right down the road, and there he is buckling down the road, making a beeline straight for me. And so, I haven't really done more remote viewing where I never targeted that individual with RV, but there was about a 2-week period where all of this stuff was happening to me all at the same time. And it happened directly after I decided to use remote viewing to look at something that was a higher dimensional entity that was associated with secret space program stuff. And I don't think that that's a coincidence, because I've spoken with a number of other professionals who really aren't interested in sharing their stuff publicly, but that they've had similar kind of things happen to them when they look at those types of targets. And so kind of bringing this full circle on why I'm not surprised about cease and desist, or why I think it's important to kind of remote view responsibly when you kind of put your nose in places that it may not necessarily be wanted, or it may get picked up, that you need to be careful with that. And I believe that on a certain level, various forms of hijacking are possible, that it's not a one-way street. And to believe that it's a one-way street, I think is a little naive based on my own experience, and just based on a number of stuff in session, in project, one of which actually, it wasn't really a negative one, but the second topic, which I'll bring up after Project Red Dog tonight, occurred, where you actually, in the remote viewing session, your data stream, as you're writing down descriptors, begins to reflect that whatever you're looking at is noticing you looking at it. And so you're transcribing them looking back at you in real time in a remote viewing session. It's a very weird phenomenon that it can occur. It's very rare, but it can happen. And it's, when you go and you remote view certain topics, there's a saying, one of the physicists, Russell Targ, who was responsible for developing remote viewing, he in a number of different talks, he mentioned that the harder that someone tries to hide something from a remote viewer, the more brightly it shines out to them in the session. And they found this just from in the Cold War, when Russians or the CIA or anyone was trying to hide something, remote viewing had no problem. In fact, it was really easy for them to go and pick up and describe. But I believe it's also somewhat true the other way around, where when you're looking at certain topics or certain life forms, for lack of a better word, that you have a light bulb on your back when you're going down that territory, and things are attracted to you because you're engaging with that type of information in the library. Whether there's an alarm bell on information patterns in the matrix, whether it's something else that's way outside of our comprehension of why these things are able to look back. I think that unless an individual has a practice of kind of protection, meditation, there's a number of different things since then that I felt it was kind of like a trial by fire, in my opinion, of how I kind of threw myself into the fire and I got burned by looking at stuff I wasn't really ready for. But I had no one telling me that was possible. And kind of coming through that out the other side, all my students that I work with, and kind of sometimes a little broken record on it, that I think you have to exert responsibility if you decide to remote view on what you're looking at, because it will affect you. And so whether or not that's the case with this individual, whether or not hijacking has occurred, which is why this legal threat is suddenly coming right now to share this type of project work with you people, I don't know. It's not really worth my time to remote view. I have better things to do, but it wouldn't surprise me. And I think that the future remote viewers, it would behoove them to use a little bit more discernment, to not look at stuff that can look back and affect them negatively until necessarily they're ready, until they've built a skill set or a tool set that allows them to do so, come out the other side without being kind of harmed by it. So it's that's just my experience. That's just, based on my own subjective experience and those of a few other professionals that I've spoken to this about. But it was very interesting. I kind of was associated with it, but it's not going to stop me from going through and sharing this information and sharing Project Red Dog. So one other thing, just from on a webinar specific, if you have questions, I am going to answer them. There will be a Q&A at the end. If you have questions, you can put them in. I think there's something on the Zoom that allows you to put a question in. If you can't stay to the very end, that's fine. You can. I'll answer all the questions that I can at the end. You can check the YouTube video if you can't stay till the end to watch the answers to those. But I'm not going to go back and forth in real time just because I have so much stuff to go over. But at the end, I will engage in a Q&A. You can ask any questions about Project Red Dog or anything else really remote viewing related. I don't mind answering those. So, okay, so I'm going to jump now into Project Red Dog and some of the information that we picked up on this. So, to begin with, just a little bit of a background on what this project, how this started, is it started on a public remote viewing community forum with a number of different intermediate and advanced viewers. And then it shifted over. A couple of those viewers decided to stay on afterwards and continue doing work. And so this is the information that, I'm not going to go step by step of all the realizations. Okay, this is what we thought it was early on. Here's how the analysis evolved over 2 years. It would just take way, way too long to go through that work. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an overall approach of what the data says, what the artifact is, what its purpose is, and kind of go down the points of what it is we're dealing with here. And again, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them at the end of the webinar. So to begin here, this is a concept sketch of the data that's associated with the work. And first thing when you're describing a remote viewing target is that when you're writing summaries or when you're just describing what's going on, is that a viewer is tasked with describing what is around whatever the target is. So in this case, it was the artifact. And we use that superlative. It's the most significant artifact. So what this is pointing to, it's whatever our unconscious deems is the most important. There's only one of those it's going to go to. And we narrow that down to just North America, just because kind of wanted to go and grab it and bring it back. Maybe something that we could do. Doing that the whole world would be a little bit more difficult. Maybe to the bottom of the ocean if we did that. So we were hoping it was somewhere in North America, and it ended up somewhere on land. But the site, what is around here, this is just an artistic representation of what the data shows. I have done a lot of geolocation work to narrow it down to where this is, and I actually know where this is actually located, or at least within about a 1 square mile of where the actual site is located, based on a few different techniques of describing the terrain, describing some of the advanced stuff there, as well as using different types of techniques where you use coordinates, north, south, east, west, things like that. But this type of terrain that's there is that it's very, very, it's in the middle of nowhere. Is that we're dealing with a natural expanse of land that's been untouched. And it's uninhabited as well. So there's very, very little sparse cover here as well. It's kind of a tundra type of environment. So small types of bushes, not a lot of tall trees, a lot of rock, a lot of dirt, sand, and ice. And so not exactly the most hospitable area, but it's in a cool climate. And what's located at the site is there is an opening or a sinkhole, which is surrounded and leads into an underground cavern. And there's actually, believe it or not, a trailhead, because there are backpackers that go fairly close to this area that exists nearby. And you can actually, and where this leads into, where this cavern leads into, there's a couple of things that have been left out here that we know about what is actually here geographically, just because they'd be a little bit too specific for what I feel like releasing right now. But this cavern, it specifically is obscured, and it was done in a way to essentially hide the entrance. And the way that this entrance was hidden is not just with a bunch of overgrown bushes. That it seems that this particular artifact, based in the era that it was created, its origin, who made it, is that they had an ability to hide this in a way that even if you were standing right up next to this surface where this cavern entrance exists, you would not be able to walk. You would not even know to walk through it. So whether that's holographic technology or something that's a mirage, or it interacts with the individual's consciousness in some way and just tells them there's nothing here, and so they move on. That I'm not really sure, but essentially it's something that's hidden. There is an opening there, but it's been hidden since essentially it was abandoned. But what exists here is, in this underground area, is a massive cavern complex, and in the cavern there's another artistic rendering that we had done, is there's a number of pyramids in this underground complex. And there's a reason why, which I'll get to in a little bit here, why that this was constructed in a cavern. But this was created a long time ago. And from a number of different sources, some of the work, some through others, where we place this time is something that's a little bit difficult to do with remote viewing, as far as like how far in the future or how far in the past. The best we can really do is like, well, what's the nearest event or the nearest thing that we can describe that we know about in time. But even that, if it was 100,000 years ago, the nearest in recorded history is a couple thousand years, so it doesn't really help us. But our best guess of the era of when this complex was created was, well, I use the term loosely because whether or not it's actually them, I don't know. But it resembles, and I've been told by others who've looked at this with other techniques, that this is Atlantean. That this is in an era where a lot of pyramids were built, and that whole civilization is essentially gone. And so this is in a specific place on the planet where this cavern for this type of artifact to operate. And but it requires the pyramid to be built in a certain way, and it requires what is located inside the pyramid to be put in a specific place for it to operate correctly. But it's a massive underground place. There's a number of different walkways. There's a number of different, for lack of a better word, protective mechanisms that would prevent people from just stumbling on into this place, that were set up when the complex was abandoned, so that people wouldn't just happen upon this place. A lot of it, though, the structures itself, because it's been there for such a long period of time, a lot of it's collapsed. A lot of the cave is collapsed, a lot of the structures collapsed, but it does appear that it would be possible in present time, based on the remote viewing work that we've done, to go all the way in and reach the artifact. Minus a couple things, which I'll talk about here. The type of mechanisms that prevent people from doing so. We ran a lot of we refer to these as queues, and so these are follow-on queues. So we ran the basic, what is the artifact? Which I'll describe in a second, but our follow-on work was, what are the threats that were, if we were, because the goal was to go there, put feet on the ground and visit the place. If we're to go there, what do we need to be worried about? And so a lot of the information that came back that gave us the parallax to understand what's going on, where things are located, is we looked at threats, as we looked at what's the natural threat, whether maybe it's a slippery floor, maybe it's something else. What's the most significant man-made threat? What's my most significant threat to me if I were to go there? And all those types of work, those projects, gave us information about how things were oriented, and essentially why it's been undiscovered for so long. And it's because it's been hidden. And in fact, even if someone got through that outside area of where that holographic kind of facade exists, that they would be unable well, at least we assume they'd be unable to move forward, because there's certain safeguards in place that unless you're a certain type of person and you have a certain type of, for lack of a better word, intention of why you're going to the site, you would not be able to pass through. And in fact, it results in a rather unpleasant end for you in some areas. So there's a lot of specific threats in this area that, if you weren't aware about, could very easily be the end of you. So, but what's located inside of this pyramid? Because that's what that's ultimately where the work pointed, where the work was pointing as far as what the target was. And it was not the pyramid itself. It was not the location itself. It was an object that was created. It was referred to it as man-made creation. So, but man-made sometimes in remote viewing work can point to things that are non-terrestrial, simply because, well, what's a human being here and a human being that's maybe not born here, but that are still similar? Man in general made it. So, our best description is that men made this, but when they made this was quite some time ago. But the artifact itself, if you were to visualize it, and I'll go into the next sketch here. The artifact itself is a stone chair, and it's carved out of the stone that actually exists at the site. That the location and the type of stone actually is really important for this specific object to do what it's been programmed, in a sense, to do. What's above it, I'll talk about in just a moment here, but the chair itself has a very interesting creation process. We ended up looking at the origin of it. We ended up looking at who created it. We also ended up looking at kind of what process. This wasn't made necessarily in a factory. What this was done, because of what we're describing is something that's so far outside of, say, our kin, or outside of my vocabulary of understanding of how something like this could be made. The best thing and the last thing, the only thing I'm really left with is metaphor. Is that it reminds me of this, or it reminds me of something that one time when I saw this experience. Because how the processes to how to actually create something like this are completely unfamiliar to me and probably anyone else that is alive today. But the descriptions we have about how this particular artifact was manufactured, if that's even the right word, probably isn't, is that it was born. That this thing has an intelligence that's associated with it. And it's a consciousness that when someone interacts with the artifact, kind of turns on, if you will, an artificial intelligence to assist the individual as they're interacting with the artifact. And it's a very helpful paperclip guy from Word, if anyone remembers from that, essentially is what is associated with this thing. The thing actually can become self-aware when someone's interacting with it. And it also facilitates the safe use of this particular artifact, as well as interacting with some other life forms that end up showing up at the site if it's used in a certain way. And so it seems that this artifact has a lot of different purposes. It doesn't have one thing that it does, but if I were to put a name on what this thing is and what it does, what we've described when, for example, I've looked at what would happen if I were to sit in that chair, what happens? Or what would happen if just someone else, say just an everyday person, were to sit in the chair? Or we've done a number of these types of what would happen if we did this, what would be the ramifications? And for the closest that I know to describe what this thing is in my vocabulary is an ascension chair. Is that this is something that transforms the individual, both their consciousness and potentially, depending on the individual, their physical body at the same time. I'll talk a little bit the specifics on that in just a second. But really what we're dealing with here, the most significant presently undiscovered artifact in North America, is an exotic transformation device. It's something that once you interact with it, it allows you, it does a couple of things, but the first thing it does is it apparently shows you all of your past lives. It removes, we described that in the work as a fog. It's memories that have been lost. That's the very first thing it does. And it shows you all this information that's been lost to you. It re-shows you that. The second thing it does is it shows you probably, I mean, it's not something that I can presently comprehend, but you can describe, is it shows you who you are in truth. It shows you the aspect of yourself, the higher self, they say the unconscious, or the there's a lot of different names for it, I suppose, but let's call it the higher self for now. It shows you very, very clearly what that is and the extent of what that is. Now, probably the descriptions in remote viewing work, the closest we have is like, this is a Satori moment, but on steroids, is where it's so intense that it requires an external device to essentially keep you intact. Otherwise, it would end up and turn into something that would not be safe to use. And so there are a number, this has been programmed. So the people who created this, though, who created this specific artifact, as there's just like parameters and a certain amount of programs that this thing can run, depending on who sits down and interacts with it. The interaction with this thing, though, is very, very specific. And it only works a certain way. That if I were to show up there just by myself, or if anyone here was to go there by themselves, say they could get all the way to the specific artifact through all the different safeguards in place, and sit down in the chair, nothing would happen. And that's because for this specific artifact to work, it requires multiple people to be standing in different places of the on the pyramid. We describe them kind of as like box seats that allow people up above to look down at where the artifact, where the individual is sitting before essentially the thing turns on. But it also requires, I don't know if it's intention, but we describe a lot in the work, and especially in some of the work that I did, that it required an intense amount of love being generated by people around, being directed at the individual sitting at the seat. That energy is what was really required to not only for the thing to work, but for anyone to sit in the chair to be able to actually make it through the experience. Because the experience, just the visual aspect of the experience, when you sit down, what happens is a whole bunch of what we described as sprites start zooming around the room when you're sitting in the chair. And then you start to hallucinate. And you begin to see images, hear voices, a lot of stuff where you sit back, you have a very unique movie theater you're sitting in, for one, and where all of this information about past lives, about your higher self, about reality, I'm sure a whole lot more that I can't even comprehend, is starting to be streamed into your consciousness. But it's very, very difficult, because some of the metaphors we used of what it's like is, if you're to sit, it's like someone, if you're sitting in that chair, someone was to take a shotgun and put that right up next to your ear and repeatedly pull that, not at you, but just past your ear. The sound of it, the reverberation of the sound would be so intense. That's the closest analogy that my unconscious had to be able to describe what goes on when this thing is turned on and is being operated. So it's incredibly loud, it's incredibly intense, and then also the emotions that are present are also incredibly intense, because it's showing you things that completely fracture and change the way that you probably couldn't look at reality the same again if that's all you decide to do, is just to go through the experience of sitting and interacting with the artifact, looking at this past life information, looking at who this higher self version of you is, having a better understanding of it. But there's one other thing that also can occur, and it seems that the artifact itself, one of the reasons why it has an aptitude to become conscious, it's an artificial type of intelligence, is that it's responsible for certain individuals, depending on their nature, depending on their intention, depending on a number of different factors, that if they sit in that chair, they're given it's referred to in the remote viewing work, an opportunity. They're given a choice to where there's another function of the whole underground area that transforms and changes the individual into something else, biologically in physical reality. And it does it in a way that completely changes. I'm gonna go through some of the specific sketches here in just a second, but essentially what it does is there's no going back. Is that when this thing, if someone accepts that and decides to kind of take this artifact and this device up on this offer, what happens is another life form shows up at the site. And when we describe this particular life form, this is what this spindly golden in this concept art is associated with the work. Because in remote viewing, it's all diagrammatic. This is associated with this other life form. And this is another life form because of where this site is located, because of where there is a mass abyss directly underneath. If I go back here, just the description of this site, there's an absolutely massive abyss underneath a lot of the structures in the pyramids here that goes deep down into the center of not to the very center of the earth, but it goes very, very deep. And what exists down there are different types of life forms that we're presently unaware of. But this artifact has the ability to call on one of these things to come up from this depth and interact with the individual in this way, which causes this transformation process. And so it doesn't seem like this happens for everybody, though. It's not even offered to everybody who actually uses this. But for some people, it does show up as a possibility. And what comes out the other end of that is something that I would not be surprised, and I'm, to be honest, somewhat hopeful that we see in our lifetime. Because one of the reasons why I find Project Red Dog so important is that this is something that was left over by an ancient human civilization. When we looked at why it was there, we looked at who created this and why did they put this here, is that in the time that civilization existed, they may or may not have used it, but it wasn't really the point, is that it was a leftover. It was put here in place as our descriptions of the work is it's like a life raft. It's for those that, for whatever reason, there were individuals that were left behind here. And so they had the wherewithal that, okay, they know that their civilization is either leaving or is no longer going to be around for whatever reason, and that this location is a life raft for any type of individual that gets left behind. And that to go through this whole process would allow them to then go to wherever this civilization has moved on to. Where that place is, I haven't done the remote viewing work. It's a whole different type of a project where that civilization is now. But the origin of this work, the origin of who made this site, they're no longer here, but this would be a way to get to them. But it requires you to essentially change really the fabric, the organic DNA of who and what you are to even be able to get there. And so I'm going to go, and the next thing I want to share here is the last project that I ran on Red Dog. And it's Project 1614, which essentially goes through the specific, I'm just going to share just the specific details about what comes out the other end of this process. But before I do that, just like kind of a quick summation, I do want to show some of the sketches of this project, of what the remote viewing data actually looked like diagrammatically. This was the first diagram that showed the facade on the side of this hill, essentially, with this. There's something here that exists deep inside of a hill, and there's a facade here, almost like holographic in nature, that prevents anyone from getting into it, unless they knew about it and or knew how to get past this particular protective mechanism. This is a diagrammatic drawing of the actual pyramid as it exists in the underground cavern. And there's a walkway. This particular drawing was interesting, this diagram, because there's a very thin walkway that leads up to this pyramid in this underground area. And the artifact is here right in the middle. But here on either side is essentially the abyss. When those specific points in the remote viewing session were explored, those are deep depths, essentially. So it was, when we were talking about, we looked at some of the threats, and the threats that showed up was this mass. You don't want to fall down in there because you're not going to be able to make it back up. So it's a very precarious walk and or climb to this particular artifact in the pyramid. But this was the first diagram, one of the first diagrams of the pyramid. this is a diagram showing one of the first drawings of the actual artifact itself, the chair. Now, the whole artifact is much larger than just the carved out chair. And so here's just a stick figure because it's a diagram. But the whole seems to be what the thing is it's stone and or a very, very large crystal that's embedded inside the pyramid. And then once you sit in the chair and you put your hands in a certain place, there's little actually grooves for your fingers to go in. And that's what starts the process once other people are at certain positions around the pyramid. Then that's what starts the process. But this is the chair that kind of it interacts with this much larger crystalline device that then interacts with you sitting in the chair. Here is the drawing, the diagram of showing once things start, the vibration, the energy that occurs. You can think of this as kind of like a side view of what's going on in the cavern. Is we have the pyramid here, down here in the center of the pyramid is where the actual chair is located. And then as this whole process is going on, something opens up here in the middle, which is described as an energetic portal, or I don't know, portal, we say loosely. It's just, I don't have any vocabulary. It's whenever you don't know what it is energetically, it's a portal. It's often sometimes what people use. It's likely that that's accurate, but it's the closest I have in my vocabulary to describe it. And then once this starts going, is that there's a reverberation off the walls of this interior chamber, which is why this whole structure was created here in the first place. And it's a reverberation, so it bounces back and forth, and it goes louder and louder and louder. It gets more and more intense as this process moves forward. Finally, here's the first sketch of what happens once the process has begun, and you begin to see these visions of memory recall, and you begin to see faces, past life versions of yourself. You basically have right out in front of you this big movie that's played, and about human history, about yourself, and about who you are at a higher level. And finally, there's this very, very interesting life form that can show up, depending on the individual if they sit in this seat, from this incredible depth underneath the site. And when we drew this thing, at first we had no idea what this was, because we were describing, okay, it was very straightforward. We have a seat that was carved into rock. Okay, fine. We have some interesting energetics that are going on here, and someone's hallucinating, or it seems like they are, and they're having all these visions. Okay, still kind of straightforward within kind of my understanding, my frame of reference. What was showing up in the work, in multiple sessions work, was this idea of a fiery tendril or a flame. And we trace what we trace this back to is, first, okay, is this whole place getting on fire? That doesn't make sense. And it wasn't. We trace it back through a lot of work, as that it pointed back to this specific life form. And this isn't a life form that walks around like you and I. This is not a human life form. This is something that, if we were to match it to anything, it would look like a squid. It would look like it has a lot of tendrils, a squid or a jellyfish, something like that. And this thing comes from deep within the earth and rises all the way to the top, right above the individual. And so there's a lot of these tendrils, and it seems to be that there's a couple purposes for this aspect. Number one is that these long tendrils end up wrapping around the individual in a way, because they're no longer present. They're no longer there in their body. They're having this experience in their consciousness, these visions, this movie that's playing. But so this thing shows up and it wraps around the individual to keep them from harming themselves. So moving or thrashing violently. That seems to be the first purpose of this thing. Second purpose of this thing is that should the individual be able to make a choice to move forward to this transformation process, this ascension chair, if you will, process that changes their DNA. This is the thing, there's something about the biology of this life form that once it interacts with human biology, changes it irreversibly. And it was very interesting in some of the data that was coming out, is because we were describing this fiery tendril that's like a somewhat drawn here diagrammatically, that ends up going down the throat into the digestive tract of the individual and releasing this liquid, this fluid into their body. And essentially that acts as a catalyst which then starts the whole transformation, the genetic changing process. The final responsibility or role of what this thing is that it also seems to relocate the individual. Say they do choose to go forward with this process, that they relocate the individual's body to somewhere far, far down in the structure. And they end up in, well, what looks like a cocoon or something like that, some sort of chamber that's filled with amniotic fluids. But this particular life form, though, this is not some gorilla. This is not some sea creature that just happens to be called. It seems to be something that is highly intelligent, because for a period of time, what actually occurs is your mind, if you were to sit in that chair, overlaps one-to-one with this particular life form's mind, their consciousness. It's like you merge for a very short period of time, and you experience what it's like to be them, to think like them, and to have their experiences temporarily. And so the analogies that came out of this work, it's like as if you take an enlightened being, whether it's a Buddha or a Christ or whoever it is, whichever religion in antiquity that's been described, someone who's been enlightened, supposedly, right? And it's to be them for 30 minutes and to look at the world and reality through their eyes. It's just so then once you no longer had that kind of perception, you no longer had that lens, you could bring back that information to yourself and now you have all of their experience to then essentially change your own vantage point, your own reality box. So during this process, what happens is your consciousness actually overlays with this thing, and this thing is incredibly advanced in consciousness. We really would describe, in my session, this is like Jesus. It's not Jesus, but it's like someone who's a spiritual being that's far, far more advanced than myself or anyone that I'm familiar with. And so it's overlapping your mind with theirs for a short period of time. One of the threat session that came out of this work, that was a man-made threat. Wait, was that the natural? I don't remember actually. One of the threat sessions showed that if you stay in that state for too long, what happens is it will completely fry your brain. And the description was brains splattered all across the wall. So it would not be beneficial to hold that state of mind for that condition for a long period of time. So it's like a short, I don't know the exact amount of time, but again, these is part of the program as far as why we believe and why I think that there's an artificial intelligence that was created specifically for this artifact to regulate this type of stuff. And so it says pre-programmed, it becomes conscious to kind of aid and abet this process of this other life form that can show up, and the individual that is interacting with that. It kind of has all the timings and the interaction. It calls the thing there, and then obviously ends it once it's completed. And so it's a very complex computer in a way, or it acts somewhat like that. But Project 16. So finally here's the last. This is the cocoon, if you will. That if the individual decides, if it's offered to the individual to change their physical body, they get brought down into a lower place and they're put in this pod, like a little stasis pod. How long, we don't really know. Again, time is not something that we're really great with remote viewing. It's hard to ascertain. I'm not sure if it's a day or a month or even a year. But it seems to be a period of time because the concept of like fasting is there. So you sit and you're not eating, but you're getting nutrients that are coming in into the body that are changing it. But you're locked away for a period of time. So the second part of the project, that was the last part of Red Dog, which I'm going to cover. And this is something that I want to just very clearly share with you guys. Because this transformation, this opportunity for individuals to use this, for lack of a better word, ascension chair, I think could be and or play a very pivotal role in what is going on, if you will, the unseen hand that's been around humanity's or civilization's neck since we can really recall. And there's a couple of reasons I believe that. The second bit of information I'm going to cover tonight ties into this, and why I think Red Dog is going to be important for that. But it's to really make a difference, to change what's going on here. And disclosure is definitely an important part. And I think talking about these type of things, and the people that need to hear the information about disclosure, about whether it's UFO, whether it's non-terrestrials, whether it's the system of control that exists here, whether you take it all the way depending on which layer you're looking at it at, from physical to non-physical to all the way to the cycle of death and rebirth. There's all these different layers you can look at it from. But I think that I would not be surprised, based off the work that I've done on this, that this particular place was left intentionally, because it would allow people to interact with, to make large change very quickly, and large change positively, and that those that would be able to use this, the only people who could do it would not be people who would use it in a way that would subjugate and dominate others, because of some of the ramifications of changing the physical body and what that does and what that affords individuals after they've gone through that process. But Project 1614 was the last Red Dog project I ran. This was May 23rd, 2015, which is funny. I didn't realize it until today that the last one was 2 years and 2 months to the day exactly after the first project Red Dog began. That was a funny thing. Funny tutu. But what I'm going to go over here is I'm just going to share this project data of what happens. This was targeting the most significant physical alteration if I or someone else were to sit in that chair. Particularly, though, in this case, I used my name to see what the change could be if I chose that. And I'm just going to read this project summary for you guys. So at the site, there are smooth, bright red sprites. And this is the process. This is what this description is. And this is when the whole thing begins, as a lot of these little wispy sprites begin moving around the room that are spread out and high above overhead. And the activity is causing turbulence, rustling in the air. It's disturbing an otherwise peaceful and uninhabited place. It's causing an earthquake of a kind that shockwaves and the ground begins to rumble. Again, this ties in with some of the previous work. And there's a group of happy individuals on a trajectory that are standing and bumbling around the site. Remind me of people, they look like stick figures, which is kind of an interesting description. But what's occurring is that bacterial evidence is being erased. Something in an individual is being dismantled and then being remade in a new way. It's eradicating biological material that's no longer necessary. And something that, before I read the rest of this, that showed up is what actually occurs for a very long time. We thought that if someone were to ever sit in that chair and go through that process, that it looked like they would die, because what was coming out on the other end of that process was not them. It was a different body. It was definitely a different consciousness that looked like on the other end. So it's something new was emerging on the other side. We ended up running one project that was my greatest false belief about this particular project. And for me, for a long time, because up to that point, I was really struggling with, man, if I ever do make it to this point, make it to this place, do I want to sit down in that chair? I don't know, because it looks like what's coming out the other end may not necessarily be you. It's almost like you're the catalyst for something else to occur. And so my greatest false belief about it, though, when I targeted that for myself about Red Dog, was that it resulted in permanent death. And that was my greatest false belief. And so that kind of confirmed for me that what's occurring here is not death of the consciousness, but there is a death of the body that occurs. Is that the human form ultimately disappears and is remade in a new way through this process. So in this particular, the greatest significant physical alteration that occurs, it described biological material as being eradicated. There's a process of where the DNA is being unwound and then rewound in a new manner. And so to do that, it looks like physical death, but it's done in a state where you're like in a stasis or a cocoon. Further on this work, though, is it showed that it described in this work, again, this majestic hovering other life form that was there. This is likely the tendril or jellyfish type of life form. And the transformation reminded me in this session of like the Passover. Something monumental is occurring here. And something inside is then arising anew. But the thing about the transformation that came out very, very clear in this, there are two key aspects. There's a couple more of the drawings on this for this, and I'll describe what they are. Well, the bottom left, those are the sprites that were moving around constantly. But the thing in the top right-hand corner is diagrammatically what emerges on the other side. And what occurs, I used, again, this is my vocabulary, but the closest visual comparison, the closest analogy I have for what comes out on the other side is I likened it to a werewolf transformation. It's the closest I had. Is that the physical body was much, much larger. And also, so the exact measurement, I'm unsure, but after the session work was concluded and during analysis, it seemed like the size of this particular body that came out the other end was anywhere between 12 and 15 feet tall. A very significant characteristic of the physical form on the other side of this were the eyes. The eyes of this life form are pure white. Is that an individual, you, myself, anyone, would be unable to look into the eyes of this thing, because it would be like looking at the intensity of the light coming off of the eyes of this life form is so bright that it would blind you to look at. And so therefore, that changes something with this type of a life form, because it means that it prevents them from ever being able to look into and have a face-to-face conversation with someone that wasn't also like it, because it would blind them. And what showed is that also there are these things that are coming off the back of this life form. Really, I liken them to wings. I mean, I'm not sure if that's exactly what they are, but whether it's just energetic or whether it's something physical, that I was a little uncertain of in the analysis, but it seemed like something like wings were coming off the back of this life form that allowed it to fly. And so this is something that has the ability to, this is something that we don't have any type of word or correlation to in vocabulary. This is an ascended being for all intents and purposes. This is something that is operating in a way, in a manner that humans don't operate in, and with a consciousness that humans don't presently have. And so how it does that, and how it would think, and how it would problem solve, or any of those type of things, we can only speculate. But the key thing at the end of this, on this project 1614, is that there was no going back. And there was, when I looked at, because we look at emotions that come out of this project, the emotions on the other side of this were deep sadness, because there was the realization that who they were before was no longer them anymore, and they would not be able to live the type of life that they had lived previously. I mean, imagine this: you made that choice, and you took that offer, and that's what you turned into. You no longer would be like, I no longer would be Brett if that actually occurred, or whoever you are. You'd be something completely different, and you'd no longer be able to operate or communicate or even interact in the way that humans interact. It'd be something far, far different. But what that does, what that affords, where that shifts this individual, is it puts you as a, if you will, on a large, reality is a big chessboard, is it puts you, you're no longer a pawn in a game. This seems to be a very large jumpstart to a much more capable life form to be able to enact change on the planet, in the universe in general. And so, which is why at the end of the day, when I describe what this artifact is, what it does, and what this looks like, is it looks like an ascension chair. This is something that moves a human, has the potential to move a human, not only to talk about who they are and understanding, but actually change them physically in reality into something else that has an availability to parts of reality that are not available to humans. But it's a one-way road. There's no going back. And so if anyone were to make that choice, I imagine it would not be a very light one, because from family to friends, I mean, this changes fundamentally who you would be. So, some of the other viewers that I discussed this with, when they got work like this, various very uncertain. Like, you go first, Brett. You sit in that first. You're gonna do it, because I don't know. I mean, that'd be a big decision to make. Whoever sits into this chair first. That's I don't know. We'll see what happens if that ever occurs in our lifetime. But so essentially, that's the other end. That's what comes out. This is a being that's operating at a different level of consciousness in physical reality. It's not something that's now on a different plane of existence. This isn't transcending. Maybe it can operate on multiple planes, but it specifically did show physical body here on the other end. But it's able to operate in a way that's far, far out surpasses probably what we can even conceive of. So the second part, and this won't take too long to go through, because this is about 2 hours so far for the webinar. But one of the things that I want to talk about here to conclude with Project Red Dog, with the artifact, is why I believe it's important. And a lot of the project work that I'll be sharing over the next couple months is going to be related to Red Dog, in the sense that it is going to paint a picture of who the actors, what agencies are responsible for what's been going on here for the past, since the beginning of recorded civilization, and why it's being done. And this one, I'm going to go into, I probably won't go all through it tonight, but I do want to kind of give a little teaser on this one, because it's directly related to Red Dog in two ways. But there's a Project PT51, which is just the name, the handle that we gave it at the time. And this is what we refer to as a topical search on moksha. And moksha is a Sanskrit word, and it refers to emancipation, liberation, and release from samsara, which is the cycle of death and rebirth. And how that occurs. How does moksha occur? And this was we had no idea what it meant or what it was associated with when this came out. And so obviously all the remote viewing work was done blind. And what came out of this project showed two very specific things. It showed, number one, that what's been going on presently here is that reincarnation, or lives, because this shows up in Red Dog, is that when you sit down in that chair, all of these memories that you've forgotten about essentially are shown to you. But becoming free from this cycle is seeing all of these lives again. And the descriptions, the diagram, is that a system has been placed, a net has been placed essentially around this reality that we're living in right now, Earth, if you want to call it that, and or larger reality. It seems to be this specifically focused on this planet, but that when you die, is the description we use. I use a description of, it's like gravitational lensing for your light or your soul, where it bends you back. Where normally you'd leave and you'd go off somewhere else, but instead, because of this system is in place, it lenses you, curves your light back, and you come right back. You come back again and again and again and again, and it shows the drawings in the remote viewing data showed a very large cage with a plethora of people, it just showed many minds essentially trapped in this cycle again and again and again and again. And for context of how to get free, the big first part of that was becoming aware of what these past lives are. But as context of the why, we looked a lot at, and probably I'll do a YouTube video showing the exact remote viewing data for this, so I can get to the question and answer tonight. But the why is that this particular type of system of control, of sending people back again and again and then forgetting who they were, of souls, is that, one, it fractures their soul again and again and again, because they keep having all these different personalities that are constantly being remade over and over and over again. But that process feeds into a much larger system, that it's energetically being fed back up a supply chain to somewhere way, way off in the distance, whether that's in the universe or dimensions, I couldn't tell you. But diagrammatically, it shows a chain between different, there's a there's a symbol for Earth, and it's referred to as the chevron within a circle on top of it, which refers to Earth. And it shows the diagram. It shows all these lines, which are referred to as a supply line, and all energy, like all roads, if you will, leading back to Rome. In this case, all this energy goes back to one place. And these supply lines, though, are being fed for conquest, as that there's an outward expansion from one place in the universe that is going outwards to then feed energy back to it. And what exists in that place we have lowercase gods, lowercase g gods. There's the best description we have for what these things are. These are things that used to be organic life forms, but their technology and their consciousness has advanced to such a degree that they're not even, you couldn't even call them necessarily they live in all this energy is essentially creating an environment for them that they're artificially living outside of time, inside of the universe. And so they essentially are immortal. But what these things are is not benevolent. These things, for lack of other word, this is essentially pure evil. As when you stick your nose into that and you start to describe what's there, is these things will look back at you very, very clearly. But when these things look back at you in a remote viewing session, they don't even care, because they look at you as such, you think of like a gorilla and a gnat. This thing is a gorilla, it sees the gnat. It's like, what a small mind. And that's the data point that comes back when you get the data streaming through in a remote viewing session of your remote viewing them looking back at you. What you'll get is you'll see them noticing you and then going, what a little mind. And then that's really it. Like, it's just no concern at all. Like, what a joke. But these are things, that's what is a key integral part of why a system of control, where this unseen hand originates from, is that it all leads back. And so all of these different groups that are here, there's a lot of information in the disclosure community and the whistleblowers that talk about the type of beings that are here and what they're doing, is that the bigger purpose behind them, it's like, how many layers do you want to go back? With remote viewing, you can go all the way back. You don't stop at what's just occurring. Whistleblowers and people who are doing disclosure, well, I think it's important to discuss what's going on here, in whether it's the MyLab programs or whether it's secret space program or whatever it is that there's kind of an end of custody that exists for them of what's happening locally in our solar system or happening locally on the planet. But with remote viewing, you can trace it all the way back. Well, where do all these roads go and why? What is it for? What is it doing? Why is this constant cycle of souls being fractured again and again and again here to feed this larger system? Why is that occurring? And in this project, Moksha, and there's other ones that kind of expound other projects, which I'll go into probably the next 1 to 2 months, that bring more clarity to this and why this is occurring. And but the central aspect seems that the energy is being used to create an artificial, timeless environment for some type of life form that used to be organic, and allows them to exist in a space that we really can't even comprehend. It's the data point is just lowercase god. That's the closest we can get. So, but I believe, kind of bringing this full circle, that the work with Red Dog, what Red Dog represents, is a key. It's a key for individuals, and I think it was left here intentionally to those that say were maybe called to it or are able to use it, to unhinge that control mechanism, that unseen hand for what exists here. Not the only thing, but maybe it plays a part. And when you remote view the most significant global effect of once this is discovered and then shared with the world, it shows massive paradigm change occurring. And so it's my hope, my hope to one day go there and to kind of make this place public, because it's the kind of thing where, anyone could know about this. But if they had a kind of an ill intention and they want to, let me go use this device, this artifact, so that I can use it to dominate others or for ill will, it doesn't seem like it would work very well for them. Is that the type of safeguards have been put in place that would prevent anyone from even getting close to being able to use this. It's just not how the thing works. that for the whole thing to even actually function, it requires a type of intention. It requires a type of mindset and a service to others, love, service to others type of thing, or it won't even turn on. And so you could view it kind of as, I suppose, an ace in the hole that was left a long time ago by an ancient human civilization, depending on what happened here. And so that's Project Red Dog, though. It's Project Red Dog. That's a little bit of a preview of the work on moksha and why I think Red Dog is important. But I think that anyone who's doing type of disclosure work of what's going on in present time, anyone who's doing remote viewing work to look at stuff and sharing that publicly, I think is important. I think that the people who, this is not something that, a lot of this type of work is outside of a lot of people's reality box. They're not ready to hear this type of stuff. It's a grand story. It's hard for me to even believe it sometimes. If I hadn't done the work blind and then seen the repeating corroboration of different viewers again and again and again come back describing the same thing, I probably wouldn't believe it myself if someone just told me, unless I actually remote viewed it. But the purpose and the significance of this doesn't really require anyone's belief for this to occur, for this to exist, and for this kind of ace in the hole to exist. And so I think it's the kind of thing that the people that need to find this information or need to hear about it will, and that when it makes sense and it's opportune to actually find a group to go to this location and to see if it makes sense within our lifetimes to interact with it, then it'll happen. But until then, I'll just end up, what I would like to do is just continue to share various projects that paint a wider picture and kind of show the board, if you will, what's been going on in present time, that maybe will motivate individuals to find other things like this too, and to seek this out, to make a difference, to make a change. Because there's this concept right now in society that one individual is pretty worthless as far as changing the world, but it's like there's so much malevolence and suffering in so many parts of the world that if you do nothing, then there will be more inevitably. And so why wouldn't you try and do something, even if it's something small? There's, I wrote it down. There's one thing to kind of, Edmund Burke was an Irish philosopher, and he's quoted, Kennedy quoted him when he said that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. It's a pretty well-known quote. There's one that's lesser well-known that I really like, and it's also by Edmund Burke, and he says, and he's quoted for saying, "Nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could do only little." And I think it's because of the perception, we've had this ingraining of we can't do anything, that it's too large, it's bigger than us and will never change, that no one makes the attempt to do something about it. And I think disclosure is a part of people trying to do something about it. I think people sharing remote viewing data is people trying to do something about it. And that, if you have the own way in your own life to do something like that, to contribute, please do. And so that's kind of where I'm left with the projects, and kind of also why I'm moving forward in the way that I'm moving forward. So with that, that concludes the presentation. And if anyone, thank you for joining me for the webinar. And if anyone has questions, I'll go through the Q&A right now and see if I can answer them as clearly as I can. So let me shift this back here. Okay, so I can go full screen. So I'll start from the top and then also look at the chat. Let me see the Q&A. All right, we got a couple here. Yeah, thanks, Charles. Thanks, Charles, for showing up. So I'll start with the Q&A questions first, and then I'll check the webinar chat afterwards to see if there's any I missed in there. Yeah, 2 hours. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. See if there are any questions. So if you have any questions right now about the project or just about remote viewing in general, I am happy to answer them. Let's see, Mishra asked, what kind of biological changes can it bring? Did it bring any change to the RVers involved? I assume you're referring to the artifact itself. Remote viewing the artifact, to my knowledge, brings no change that I'm aware of, other than perhaps the knowledge of it may change your opinion or your point of view, but there's no biological change by simply remote viewing the artifact itself. But obviously, if you sit in this chair, what occurs is it gives you the option to change you genetically. That actually turns into something else. That is what turns you into, essentially, for all intents and purposes, a different life form. And it's a type of life form that has an aptitude for things that are much higher level than what human consciousness is, or the human body is even capable of doing. Let's see. Charles asked, could you please elaborate about why you characterize the end of the chain of custody as evil, despite it requiring love vibration to activate? No, that's good. So the end of the chain, I was referring to moksha. So following why death and rebirth again and again back, why that occurs, leads back to a type of civilization that is far, far more advanced than what we are. And the condition that humanity is in right now, of dying and being reborn without any memory, the soul again and again and again and again and again, repeating new lives it seems like forever as far as what the work. It showed like a bunch of bees. The analogy that was used in the work was like a beehive, and that there's someone, if you will, who's put the box around the bees to collect their honey. And in a way, it's to collect the energy of the souls by moving again and again through this process. The specifics, so that had actually nothing directly tied to the artifact. The artifact is something different. It was a different civilization. So the civilization that created the artifact is different from the one that I'm referring to, that when you trace back where moksha came from and why this system of control exists here today, those are two different civilizations. The one that created the artifact seemed to be a fairly benevolent civilization. In fact, they had that foresight to see that something like this would be needed potentially in the future. And so they built this place to stand time, to exist here when it was needed, as a life raft for humans of the future from their perspective. And so it's an ancient civilization that put it here, the artifact, to basically be a type of an ace in a hole, to combat what they believed does exist now, if you trace it back all the way up, which is an outward expansion of, whether it's, I'm not going to speculate at this point or go into those other details on what that civilization is. But when you follow the chain back all the way of why the reincarnation exists here, there's concepts of prison planet are really not far off when it comes to soul. And why that exists is that's traced back to of energy going back to Rome, road leading back, is there is a group that is using and feeding off the energy of that process of being reborn into a new body again and again and again, and fracturing the soul again and again. And kind of the outcome of that is not a good one. It's not a good one. If that goes unchecked and we don't do something about it, I'm hopeful that things, and this is why things like Red Dog, I believe, exist. This is why I believe there's a lot of people on Earth today that are here because there's hope, because this isn't going to go the way that necessarily those that are kind of profiting or off the energy, if you will, that are coming from this place, to change that. But when you view where that energy is going back to, you go to you get descriptions of very evil things that are not pleasant. And, but yeah, so very different civilizations. Has nothing to do. It's connected to Red Dog in the sense that previous civilization left that structure, that artifact here, to combat something like this, because it would give humans the ability to quick start their engine, if you will, to jump over who knows how long's worth of millions of years of evolution or consciousness very, very quickly into something that would be able to then combat something, or to rectify or protect against something that is so far outside of our capability at this point that we can't even comprehend it. So hopefully that makes sense. Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. Nelson asks, 2 questions. Have you remote viewed the possible link of Mecha and planet Saturn? Can you use the word why in a queue? You can. So to answer your second question first, as far as why, you can view the purpose, and the purpose typically gets to the why. When you look at the purpose of why something exists, so it's the purpose of the activity, the purpose of the target, or the purpose of the site, it usually answers the why question. So you can get at that very, very quickly after a basic remote viewing session with that follow-on work. But as far as Saturn is involved and Mecha, there's definitely, yes, but I don't want to go into it right now. It's something that, not Mecha, I haven't actually looked at Mecha, but what's going on Saturn is something that is very significant to what's been going on here for a very long time. But that type of details is not something I feel, I haven't really organized how I want to present that data yet. So I don't really want to just off the cuff talk about it. There is something that's been going on there. It is associated and linked to the supply chain, if you will, for lack of a better word. But the specifics would be another YouTube video or presentation. Mecha, I haven't really looked at Mecha. John asks, have you tried to do an optimum trajectory to access the device, or is this beyond any access at this point? It's a good question. Somewhat. I've looked at for myself, and I know some of the other viewers have looked at for themselves as well. What are some of the optimum provisions to take should we attempt to go there? And from that type of work and some of the related stuff, that's when we got don't go alone, because first it wouldn't work. But at the same time, you also, it does seem possible. But it seems, I mean, where this thing is located, it would take quite a bit of money to go actually and have a reconnaissance to actually go find the thing and figure out how to get in. You know, use remote viewing to do that to help. We know there's information which I really haven't talked about tonight because I don't think it's relevant on how you get past a couple of these things to get on the inside. But you know, when the time comes, if it comes in my lifetime to actually go to this site and explore this particular artifact, then, you know, I think that I'm going to trust synchronicity to work for me on that point. And if the other people involved show up as well, because it's something that it requires the right people. It requires the right intention of people and the right souls, if you will, to be able to unlock this place. This thing was locked away so that not just anyone could just touch it, because the ramification of anyone had the ability to just do this, to flip that switch, it'd be catastrophic. I mean, you give these abilities, that transformation process, to say a serial killer or something like that, it would be horrific. But you know, the people who created this artifact had the wherewithal, and they knew this, and so they put these type of safeguards in place. These are things that are far out. I mean, it just wouldn't work. They designed it in a way for it not even to work unless the right people with the right intention was involved. So is it an optimum trajectory? I've certainly looked at a couple things kind of similar to that. We looked at kind of optimum provisions and how to do it, but anything beyond that, I haven't looked at. I think you definitely could remote view what's the optimum way for either myself or even you to get to that site. You could definitely do with remote viewing. Or even whether or not you should sit in the chair. You know, like you could do that too, I suppose. Okay, next question in the Q&A. Rodney asks, do you, and if you do, would you share dimension of the pyramid, the chamber the chair is in, the chamber that the pyramid is in that resonates the energy when the chair, when it's going on, the exact size and the dimensions. You know, the precise dimensions, numbers are tricky with remote viewing, where you can get close approximates, but like exact dimensions with RV, it's very difficult to get precise numbers. I hope one day that the RV methods are, they evolve to the point that you are able to get that type of information. But remote viewing, in a sense, is this is describing without naming, and it uses a vocabulary and a very specific methodology to describe a target. and getting 25 feet and 6 inches and whatever is not the type of data that usually comes out. Maybe that's possible. I haven't really explored that, but at this current time, I don't know the precise sizes or measurements, other than a very generic approximates. Fairly large. It seems pretty big. It doesn't help, but it seems pretty big. The chair, I mean, it's carved into the stone of the place, and then there's a fairly large crystal that's right over the top of it. The size of the crystal, it seemed from the drawings maybe the size of a car or an SUV. It seemed how big it was. Size of the cavern, I'm not sure. Jennifer, did you say, is this artifact on Earth? Yes, this is in North America, in a rather desolate and uninhabited part of North America. Underground. Another question is, not a question, be great to remote view the next human that's going to use the artifact or its most recent use and pinpoint it. Great project. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, thanks, Nelson. It would be. Definitely could be done. I mean, obviously, when you're looking in the future, it's more, I would probably say, more probabilistic than certain. But you definitely could. I mean, I've looked at what Project 1614 ultimately was looking at, if I were to use it next, what would happen? What would be the most significant physical alteration if I were to use it in that context of if I were to go there, if I were to sit down in it, and if I were to accept. So you definitely can do that. And it's from that type of work that we gained an understanding of what was possible with the artifact. I'm going to check out, so that's all the Q&A questions I have. I'll go through a little bit of the chat to see if I missed anything. Okay, I'm glad that you fixed the audio by restarting. That's good. You did a project for Ed, Dame's MIA, that he later told others to stay away from. Sure, absolutely. Yeah, there's, part of, I'm going to be talking about a little bit more about this in the future. Actually, at the end of this month, I'm going to be talking about this. But I have a couple of projects underway. I have another, actually, at the end of this webinar, it'll be in the email afterwards too, just to follow up. But I actually have a second free webinar at the end of this month, which is going to be associated with getting more information out to the public on how to begin remote viewing yourself and doing it in a way that's responsible. Because one of the things that I feel really compelled to be a part of and to create is a community of viewers that remote view responsibly and do it in a way that's not at each other's throats because they're not using the correct method, or my method's better than your method, but also does it in a way that fosters kind of the self-improvement, self-exploration of new techniques and new methods, but also with the instruction, with the collaboration of other individuals. It's teaching it in a way that does it responsibly. And it's not that, listen, I think that looking into the void is fine. Just, you need to do it and understand that it's going to look back. And you need to be prepared for that. And if you're not, then it's going to affect you negatively. And so, don't give those type of projects to people and warn people away from those types of projects that aren't ready for them. That seems like common sense to me. That seems to be the kind of thing that people should be talking about. It's responsibility. And it's a type of responsibility that I think has just been missing. And that could be because, this was a military tool originally. And so, there are no ethics and it's just do it in the military, right? And so maybe it never, if this had originated in civilian hands, maybe it would have been a little bit different. I don't know. But I think it's something that's important. So things like spiritual protection, things I think like using meditation to protect your psyche from different types of non-physical and non-local attacks, like being able to remote view what the ramification of looking at something is first. Like, why not do that? Like, okay, if I look at this specific thing, what is that going to negatively affect me? Well, sure, you can look at that. You can very easily determine that without even going close to whatever that topic is. Should I look at this or not? A very simple type of associative remote viewing project on that. That doesn't even touch the topic. So or the target. So this is something that I'm going to be doing some free webinars to get people kind of hopefully jazzed and hyped about remote viewing, but then also setting up a community as well of individuals if they want to learn and become part of that community. It'll be kind of a multidisciplinary approach. It's not just remote viewing. I've taught remote viewing since 2013. I've written a book about it because the type of method that I use, there was no written information about that method. The only way to learn the method that I learned, which is a variation of controlled remote viewing, was to spend thousands of dollars and to learn one-on-one essentially from the pros. And I was fortunate enough at the time that I could afford to do that. And that's most people don't have that luxury. And so does it surprise anyone that there's not, when a lot of these type of techniques, there is free stuff out there for remote viewing, but a lot of the real advanced stuff, it's locked behind doors that are real steep. And writing the book was a way of kind of trying to remove some of those mountains. And kind of this next project, which I'll be talking about at the end of the month in that webinar, hopefully will also be part of that as well. Let's see, I'll check more here in the chat. The object described has an eerie similarity to a being described in the Mahabharata. There's a lot of interesting correlations between ancient Hindu culture and some of the stuff that comes out as far as larger beings with bodies that are, say, 40 feet tall, with glowing eyes, things of that nature, where they can levitate through the air and move through the air, disappear and reappear. A lot of these are essentially the faculties that this type of artifact affords individuals who are able to go through the whole process. But it certainly does that the myths of old, prior to, let's say, recorded history, the stories that they were left with describe individuals that seem to have similar type of abilities. And so are those individuals that may have used an ascension chair like this? Maybe they were able to do it naturally without a type of technology. I don't know, but there are similarities. So an OBE chair, kind of. Neurofeedback. Let's see what this next thing is here. Is this the same red dog on the RV? Angel protects scions. It is the same red dog on the RV forum, except it's about a year and a half more worth of work over various months, with breaks in between. And so on that forum project, it started on the forum. And what we thought at the time is maybe it was just our analysis at the end of that was maybe this artifact is like a UFO or something. You could sit in it. It showed the chair, this like a seat, a compartment you could sit in. It wasn't too big, and had all these energetics that were going on that were wild, and then this ability to move. It seemed to be that you were moving your conscious mind to somewhere else. But it's not precisely what it was. We did a lot more work to really nail down exactly what this was. And that it's certainly not a UFO or like a craft of some kind that you could fly around. Not quite. Let's see. Any other questions here? Yeah. No, there's definitely some interesting points, JB, and as far as what may or may not be going on here, a big part of more of what Stories for the Matrix is going to become. I'm going to be doing other video presentations, not just necessarily live webinars, but talking about projects that kind of spell out who some of the other players, I use that term loosely, are in essentially around our neck of the woods. Terrestrial and non-terrestrial. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. See any other things here? I'm just catching up on all the chat. Eagles win Super Bowl. Hey, Norbert, appreciate it. Let's see, on reincarnation, very good psychic explained it was being here to learn a lesson, reincarnating over and over, lesson, almost like a punishment for the soul. It depends which way you look at it. I would somewhat agree with that answer as far as what reincarnation is. As far as reality is concerned, the big picture of what physical reality is, if you look at that as, say, a topical search, what comes out of that work is it's like to learn a lesson, to see, and also to see, if you're good or evil, kind of who you are at a fundamental level, through a series of tests. But as far as reincarnation is concerned, from the work that I've done, it doesn't seem to be that reincarnating in the same place again and again and again without memory of previous reincarnations or previous lives is normal in the known universe. But that's something that's very not normal. It's something that actually keeps you from progressing. Because if you think about it, how are you supposed to learn a lesson or have a greater understanding if that whole previous life is completely unavailable to you? You have no access to it. It's not, other than at the most base unconscious levels. So it seems like a very poor system, right? And well, it's a poor system because it's designed that way. It's designed to keep people here, because keeping people here, souls here, whatever that is, feeds into a much larger system, and it powers that system. And this is a system that constantly is expanding and trying to create more scenarios like what we have here in other places on other planes, whether it's a planet or something we can't visualize or comprehend. So Richard asked, any idea how many people have passed through the chair and when its most recent use was? I don't know. I actually don't have the answer to that question. We looked at the construction of it. We looked at how it's constructed, which it was so interesting when we looked at the origin, the specific. It showed 1,000 people standing in place and willing it into existence, like giving birth to it. How that is possible, I don't know. That's the closest match we have with our vocabulary, and but its last use, I have to fall back on the time answer. Time is a really difficult thing. We don't have the type of parallax, the specificity yet with remote viewing methods to get that type of information yet. Like whether it's, we speculate that this was Atlantean. Postulate. I don't know for certain. But that's our best guess. Maybe something way, way older than that. But yeah. Let's see. Any other questions in here? Something is hidden in the idea. I'm unsure what you mean, Ronnie. The idea that something is hidden and an idea of what it might be about and for. If you ask the question again, I can answer that one. So what is the alternate trajectory to end this reincarnation cycle? That's a very good question. That's what moksha is. And from the remote viewing work, just really the short end of that is, a big piece of that is gaining access to all your past lives. That's the first step on that process, is you have to reclaim that information. That's the very first part. And then there's a lot of other stuff kind of after that, which I really don't have time to go into here as far as what I've remote viewed. But that seems to be the first step. Well, great. I think that is all of the questions, and I appreciate you guys hanging out with me and going over this work. Before you guys go, though, I'm going to go back. If you haven't done this, let me go to... If you want to follow me, it's a good place to end. Is definitely check me out on Twitter, on Facebook, and YouTube, where this is going to show up. Tactical Intuition, if you search for that. The likes and the follows definitely help as far as reaching a larger audience. And also, if you want the updates, definitely follow me on all these. Well, I also, if you like this type of content, and you'd like to see more of this type of stuff, you can also support me on Patreon as well. It's a way. I have a couple supporters there, and one of the things that I plan on doing in the future, probably beginning at the end, maybe the beginning of next month is when this will start, is that for those who support on Patreon this work, is that all the podcasts that I'll be releasing is that you got early access to those, as well as I'll be hosting a private question and answer for anything under the sun, for anyone who is interested. Kind of like what I'm doing here, but in a little bit larger setting, before going through a 2-hour webinar every month. So about like a 30-minute Q&A for patrons as well. So if you like that and you're interested in supporting Stories from the Matrix and the podcast, check me out on Patreon. But other than that, I think that's all I have for this evening. I'll just check the chat one more time to make sure I don't miss anything. Thank you all so much for showing up this evening. And this will be on the YouTube channel in probably a day or two. Yeah, definitely. If you missed part of the presentation, it'll show up again. Check the YouTube channel, Technical Intuition, because the full recording will be up there. All right. Well, guys, thank you all for showing up. Have a wonderful evening. And until next time, stay safe. Cheers.